The room was still buzzing with laughter when I felt the sting of humiliation rise in my chest, like a sudden blast of cold air cutting through the warmth. I remember staring down at that empty plate in my hands, the overhead lights reflecting off its glossy surface as if mocking me, while everyone else piled their plates high without even noticing I hadn't eaten. If you've ever trusted the wrong people, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this happen in ways you never expect. I stood there frozen, feeling small, invisible, and strangely numb, as if the whole party had shifted into slow motion just to make sure I absorbed every second of it. That was the moment everything started to unravel. Let me show you how it all began. I can still feel the weight of that moment, the room buzzing with small talk, the smell of frosting and wrapping paper lingering in the air, and me standing there with an empty paper plate that suddenly felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. It's strange how humiliation can land without anyone needing to raise their voice. All it took was a few careless words tossed into a crowd. A few chuckles that weren't meant to hurt but cut straight through me anyway. I remember the sting in my chest, the way I tried to steady my breath, pretending I didn't feel every pair of eyes drifting toward me, waiting to see how I'd react. I held my smile for as long as I could. I even told myself it didn't matter, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, something shifted. It was like a string that had been pulled too tight for too long, finally snapped. I realized I'd been letting moments like these stack up, brushing them off as nothing, convincing myself that being quiet was the same thing as being graceful. So I set down that plate, grabbed my purse, and slipped out the front door. No one stopped me. No one even noticed. And as I walked to my car, the cool air hitting my face, I finally understood that the party wasn't the real issue. It was only the breaking point, the final straw in a story that had been building for years. And to understand why that moment cut so deeply, you'd have to know how everything began. 4 years before that birthday party, everything felt different. I remember the day the first request for help came in. It wasn't dramatic or demanding. It sounded desperate, trembling, almost apologetic. I could hear the strain behind every word, and something in me softened instantly. I had just finished paying off my own mortgage after decades of steady work, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt a little financial breathing room. So when my son and his family said they were on the brink of losing their home, it felt impossible to turn away. I told myself it was a one-time lifeline, a simple bridge until things settled for them. I didn't question it. I didn't analyze it. I just stepped in. But 1 month quietly became another, then a sudden car issue, then a medical bill, then something about delayed paychecks. Every new reason seemed believable enough, and each time I reached into my savings, I reminded myself that family helps family. I convinced myself it was temporary, that any moment now they would regain their footing. I didn't see it as a pattern forming. I saw it as me being dependable, steady, useful. Still, Small signs began to gather like dust in corners I never bothered to clean. A renovated living room that didn't match the story of barely making ends meet. A vacation photo that didn't line up with talk of budgeting. Little inconsistencies that flickered through my mind, but never stayed long enough for me to confront them. I brushed everything aside because I was afraid of what it might mean if I looked too closely. I told myself that raising concerns might push them away, that questioning them might break whatever fragile closeness we had left. What I didn't want to admit was that a piece of me feared being alone more than I feared being taken advantage of after losing my husband. My son and his family became the only constant I had. So I let the months turn into years, and the years turn into a quiet, heavy routine of giving more than I could emotionally afford. By the time that birthday came around, the tension inside me had been building for a long while. I just didn't see it clearly until the moment I stood there holding an empty plate. That humiliation didn't create the truth. It revealed it, and it pushed me toward a reckoning I could no longer postpone. The moment when I finally sat down and added up everything I had poured into their lives. The morning after the party felt strangely calm, almost too calm for what had happened the night before. I remember standing in my kitchen, sunlight stretching across the counter, trying to settle my breath after a night spent replaying every uncomfortable second. And then, as if nothing had happened, another request for the mortgage arrived. Casual, routine, delivered with the same expectation as always. There was no pause, no hesitation, not even the slightest acknowledgement of how I'd been treated. It washed over me with a kind of coldness I couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time in 4 years, instead of reaching for my checkbook, I reached for my file drawer. I pulled out every bank statement I had, spreading them across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle I had avoided putting together. My hands trembled as I started adding the numbers, each transfer reflecting a moment I'd convinced myself I was doing the right thing. Month after month, year after year, the total climbed higher. When I finally reached the end, the number staring back at me didn't even look real. It felt like seeing my own reflection and realizing I didn't recognize the person looking back. A wave of grief hit first. Grief for the money, for the trust, for the years I couldn't reclaim. Then came a deeper ache, the kind that sits in your chest when you finally admit to yourself that you've been taken for granted. But under all of that, something else began to rise. A steadiness, a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't being unkind. I had been giving far beyond what was reasonable, and I had been doing it alone. By the time I finished gathering the paperwork, the decision was already forming. I needed guidance, real guidance. Not guilt, not excuses, not another promise that things would change. So I called an attorney, and as I pressed that number, I knew something had shifted permanently. What I didn't realize yet was how strongly my son and his wife would push back once they realized I was no longer operating on blind trust. That battle was coming next. When I walked into the attorney's office, I felt like a woman carrying 4 years of invisible weight on her shoulders. I expected to feel embarrassed as I laid everything out. The transfers, the excuses, the fear I'd been living under without even naming it. Instead, what I felt was something closer to relief. For the first time, someone looked at the situation without family loyalty clouding the truth. Hearing a professional calmly describe my experience as a pattern of financial exploitation was jarring, but it also steadied me. It made me realize that my pain wasn't imaginary. My instincts hadn't failed me. I had simply ignored them for too long. By the time I left her office, everything inside me felt sharper, clearer. I wasn't angry in the way people imagine anger. It was quieter than that, like a door finally locking into place. I had boundaries now, legal ones, and for the first time in years, they didn't feel selfish. They felt necessary. Of course, the moment my son realized I wasn't bending anymore, the tone changed. What started as mild confusion slid quickly into fear. Suddenly, he was showing up unannounced, pacing, speaking with that frantic energy people carry when they know something is slipping out of their control. I could feel the entitlement under his panic, the disbelief that I would dare create distance between his choices and my bank account. And then came his wife. Her approach was different, colder, sharper. She shifted between performative concern and thinly veiled resentment, as if my desire for boundaries was an offense against the entire family. When guilt didn't work, she pivoted to intimidation. Hearing her suggest that maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, that maybe someone should evaluate whether I was capable of managing my own affairs, sent a chill through me. It's a cruel tactic, twisting a person's age into a weapon. What they didn't know was that I had already anticipated it. Before confronting them, I'd gone through a full cognitive evaluation. Every test confirmed what I already felt inside. I was not confused. I was not unstable. I was simply done being controlled. As their pressure mounted, calls, messages, attempts to corner me into familiar patterns, I felt something unexpected, strength, a deep, anchored certainty that I had every right to protect myself, even if it meant facing their anger. But underneath their desperation, something else was brewing, a truth I hadn't uncovered yet, one that would change everything I thought I understood about the past 4 years. And that revelation was just about to surface. The call came on an ordinary morning, the kind where I thought the worst of my problems was deciding whether to start another load of laundry. Hearing a detective introduce herself sent a cold ripple straight through me. I remember gripping the counter as she explained why she was calling, saying that my bank activity had surfaced during an investigation into financial elder abuse. I felt my chest tighten as she walked me through the pattern she'd noticed. Regular transfers, escalating amounts, no documented reason. She wasn't accusing me of anything. She was trying to understand whether I was the victim, Then came the blow I never saw coming. She told me they'd been tracking my son for months, not because of anything I'd done, but because he had fallen into deep gambling debt. Not casual bets, not a bad habit, a full-blown addiction that had pulled in thousands upon thousands of dollars. The money I thought was keeping a roof over their heads had been diverted into online gambling accounts and dangerous lenders. Hearing she believed collectors might start showing up if the debts weren't paid shattered whatever anger I'd been holding on to. Suddenly, the situation wasn't just about betrayal. It was about safety. My grandsons, and even my unborn grandchild's. When my son finally came to my house that evening, I barely recognized him. The exhaustion in his face, the tremor in his hands, the broken way he sank into the chair across from me. It all told the truth before he opened his mouth. Through halting breaths and strained silence, he admitted everything. How the gambling began as something small, how he kept chasing losses, how my support freed up his paycheck, how shame kept him lying, and how fear had swallowed him whole. He wasn't making excuses. He was unraveling, and for the first time, I didn't feel manipulated. I felt the weight of a child who had lost control of his life. My heart was torn in two, one half grieving the deception, the other half terrified for what might happen if I walked away. But I also knew this couldn't be another quiet rescue. So I drew a line. I told myself that if I paid the debts, it would only be under one condition: he entered treatment immediately. No negotiation, no delays. That night, I drove him to the airport and watched him leave for a recovery center, carrying one suitcase and the faintest spark of hope. As he disappeared past security, I knew the next part of this journey would be about rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, and honestly. When my son entered treatment, I felt a strange mix of heartbreak and relief. Watching him walk into that facility was like watching the door close on the last 4 years of chaos. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope that something better might grow out of all the pain. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. But in that quiet, I began to breathe again. I began to understand that loving someone didn't mean sacrificing myself completely, and helping someone didn't mean shielding them from every consequence. Little by little, signs of change started to appear. The first repayment he sent, just $50, might have seemed insignificant on paper, but to me, it felt monumental. It meant he was showing up, even from inside treatment. It meant he understood that healing wasn't only emotional, it was financial, practical, and long overdue. I tucked that payment into a folder I labeled New Beginnings, because that's exactly what it felt like. Back at home, his wife surprised me too. She found steady work at a local nonprofit, built a budget she actually followed, and began attending support meetings for families dealing with addiction. I could see her shedding old habits, impulse spending, defensiveness, denial, and replacing them with something more grounded. For the first time, She approached me without the cloud of resentment or entitlement. She approached me as someone trying to rebuild, not someone demanding to be rescued. My grandson adjusted faster than any of us. Children have a way of finding light even in the cracks. He flourished at his new public school, made friends easily, and settled into a routine that didn't revolve around tension or whispered arguments behind closed doors. Our weekly visits became something steady and warm, little pockets of joy that reminded me why I had fought so hard for this family in the first place. And then the new baby arrived. A tiny girl with bright eyes who felt like a symbol of renewal none of us expected. Holding her for the first time, I felt something inside me settle. Not everything was fixed, but things were finally moving in the right direction. Through all of this, I found my own healing too. Boundaries stopped feeling like walls and started feeling like doorways. Ways to walk into relationships with clarity instead of fear. And that understanding set the stage for the final lesson this journey taught me. A lesson I hold closer than anything else. Looking back on everything we went through, I realized the hardest part wasn't the money or even the betrayal. It was learning to separate love from sacrifice and compassion from self-erasure. For so long, I thought being a good mother meant carrying everyone else's weight without ever admitting how heavy it felt. But life has a way of forcing clarity, and sometimes the moment that breaks you is the same moment that finally sets you free. What I know now is simple boundaries are not walls. They are pathways, lines that protect love instead of smothering it. When I finally stood up for myself, I didn't lose my family. I helped us rebuild on something real. My son found his footing. His wife grew into a steadier version of herself. My grandchildren are safe and surrounded by a calmer home. And I rediscovered a quiet strength I didn't realize I had lost. If you're listening to this and carrying your own version of this burden, I hope you hear this clearly. You are allowed to draw the line. You are allowed to choose peace. Have you ever faced something like this? Share your experience in the comments. I read everyone.